Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to allow people to join. We've kind of people coming into the webinar as we speak, and we'll just wait 1 or 2 minutes just to make sure that we have as many as possible on the call before we begin. Right, I think we'll make a start. Just to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and a few housekeeping things to go through before we start. My name is Aisling Kennedy. I'm a member of the Society's Sustainability and Climate Change Committee, and I'll chair the session today. Lucy Say is presenting, and then we'll hopefully have time for Q&A. We are recording the webinar, and we will be recording the Q&A as well. You can ask your questions at any stage during the meeting using the Q&A box to type a question, and we'll keep the Q&A towards the end. Once you've registered with your full name, important to note, we'll have record of your attendance. There's no longer a need for verifiable CPD in our own CPD scheme, but we appreciate you may need it for other organisations. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lucy and the Planetary Solvency paper. So the Planetary Solvency paper is the IFoA's 4th report in collaboration with climate scientists. It develops a framework for global risk management to address climate risks and shows how this approach can support future prosperity. It also shows how a lack of realistic risk messaging to guide policy decisions has led to slower action than is needed. So it proposes a risk dashboard to provide decision-useful risk information to support policymakers to drive activity within the finite bounds of the planet that we live on. Lucy is one of the co-authors of the paper. She is also a past chair of the IFoA Sustainability Board, and her actuarial work spans traditional life insurance as well as sustainability-specific topics, including climate scenarios, disclosures, and risk management. She's also the author of a paper on biodiversity, and she has presented previously to the Society on that topic. Without further ado, Lucy, over to you.
Thanks, Aisling. So indeed, as Aisling said, this is our 4th collaboration between the IFoA and climate scientists. First with the Climate Crisis Action Group, so Sir David King's outfit, and then more recently the scientists at the University of Exeter. Now, a key theme throughout this is going to be that we're not actually presenting, I'll just let the disclaimer sit here and then we'll jump in, and we're not actually presenting new climate science. So this is very much about putting a risk lens onto climate science and applying risk management techniques that we'll all be familiar with into this sort of field. So we're going to talk today about global risk management. We're going to be talking about communicating with policyholders, all of the good sort of risk identification, assessment, reporting, communication stuff that we'll be familiar with. So just on the agenda for today, we'll do a bit of a definition of what planetary solvency is and how we get from a financial solvency approach to a planetary solvency approach and explain that sort of analogy. We'll also look at some of the outputs of planetary solvency in the sort of terms of a risk dashboard, and then we'll drill down a bit more into the climate and nature examples. So when we look at planetary solvency, what do we actually mean? We look at this as saying, quite obviously, but not often recognised, is that we depend on the Earth system. So The benefits that are provided to us by nature, so things like our raw materials, our water supply, they're not substitutable. We can't replace those by technology once they're gone. And this means that our economies and our societies hang on having a healthy planet, and we're dependent on the health of the planet for our ongoing prosperity. Now, if we want ongoing success, we have to manage ourselves within planetary boundaries. Now, these are these scientifically established criteria of, or a group of Earth system processes that include things like climate change limits, biosphere integrity, fresh water use, nutrient cycling, all of those sorts of things. And we've identified these limits scientifically, and beyond those limits, the environment may not be able to self-regulate. So we might be in an area where we're from this sort of very hospitable planet into one that doesn't support the societies that we're used to. And if you're sat here with a risk hat on, which I'm assuming most people are, you might already be thinking, well, hang on a minute, this sounds familiar. This sounds very much like a risk limit. This sounds like us managing ourselves to avoid insolvency. We'll look at how we're doing shortly, but needless to say, we're not currently managing our activity to ensure the ongoing ability to provide for society. And we'll hopefully make a good argument today as to why we should do this and why we'd want to do this. And then we'll look at the sort of urgent need for policy action. So currently, we're seeing climate change and nature loss driven by human activity that on a scale that threatens the planet. So 6 out of 9 of the identified planetary boundaries are breached. We're seeing unprecedented natural disasters, so fires, heat waves, floods, and storms. And we've seen a knock-on impact of these on things like food security. So we're already seeing sort of higher food prices because of underlying risks from climate change. And interestingly, I Googled the other day, why are food prices in the UK so high? And one of the things that came up was climate impacts. So it is getting out there. And there are a number of other things as well, but exacerbated by that. And that is, again, a theme that climate and nature risks exacerbate already existing societal fragilities. But as I said, we're seeing these unprecedented changes, but we're also at risk of triggering climate tipping points. So this diagram shows some of these processes. Now, climate tipping points, if you're familiar with some of the other papers, they are these sort of cliff edge processes. So they're the things that have these positive feedbacks, they're self-perpetuating. And when you cross a threshold, you move from sort of something that is relatively benign into something that is not. And what we know is that when we look at the temperature thresholds for these tipping points, once we start getting to that 1.5 degree threshold, the risk of crossing those increases quite substantially. And when we look at that 1.5 to 2 degree range, we are at risk of crossing thresholds for things like the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, coral reefs, permafrost, Barents sea ice. All of those have widespread impacts. So by definition, climate tipping points have large and widespread impacts. That's how we identify them. But to give a little bit of flavour to these, your sort of combined impact of your Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet melting is 10 metres of sea level rise. Barents sea ice disruption, so that has big impacts on your weather patterns across Europe and the UK. If we look at the one of the tipping points, so the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So that's this big conveyor belt circulation of ocean currents that takes warm water from the tropical regions and disperses it to the poles. We know that with 2.5 degrees of warming, if we then also get AMOC collapse, we lose half of the land suitable for growing wheat, maize and rice. So our staple food crops, the land available to support that halves. And worryingly, some scientists estimate that there's a 45% chance of that happening as early as 2040. And this is where the risk perspective comes in, because from a risk perspective, we would be saying, hang on a minute, this is too high, and we should be taking action to avoid it. Whereas the climate side, they would say, well, hang on, how, where, at what threshold is this likely to happen? Let's try and predict what is happening. We also know that climate tipping points can cascade. So, and the impact of these, unfortunately, is to collectively lower those thresholds. So where we were looking at tipping elements in isolation, we know that once one goes, it increases the likelihood of others also tipping. So it collectively lowers those temperature thresholds at which we're likely to see these discontinuities emerge. So how do we bring all of this together into what we call planetary solvency? So we've defined planetary solvency as managing human activity to minimize the risk of societal disruption from the loss of critical support systems. Now, how did we get here? So I'm going to talk us through how we got from a sort of financial solvency where we're managing assets to provide liabilities over the long term to doing this in a planetary aspect. And then we'll talk about realistic risk assessments and how those can support us to achieve planetary solvency. So as we know, we're all familiar with managing risk and uncertainty over long time horizons to ensure financial institutions stay solvent. And essentially, it's quite easy to talk to actuaries about this because we know what solvency means. Not everybody does. But here we're talking about making sure we've got enough assets today and at future time periods to meet current and future liabilities with a high level of probability. So we're very, very likely to remain solvent. Now, we know that to do that, we explore risks, we look at what might go wrong, and then we identify actions to mitigate those risks and to ensure that we remain solvent over that time period. Now, in planetary solvency, we've replaced the financial institution with the planet. We say our planet is providing us with ecosystem services. So those raw materials, that food, that water, those are our liabilities. If we want to continue providing these benefits, continue meeting those liabilities over the long term, we have to manage our natural assets sustainably. If we erode those assets, we lose those ecosystem services and we become insolvent. So if we're monitoring how we're currently doing and we're monitoring our planetary solvency, we'd look at those planetary boundaries and that we'd say, okay, if we're already breaching some of those, what action should we take to avoid insolvency? Because that would be an indication that we're heading in the wrong direction and we're heading towards this sort of insolvent bottom right-hand corner. Now, this would include actions such as limiting global warming in line with the Paris Agreement. It would include meeting the commitments we've made under the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we did that, we would have some way of, or some chance of maintaining what we're calling this sort of good Anthropocene. So the solvent planet, this carbon, low carbon, nature positive and fair and just. And we'll come on to, again, what we mean by that later on. If we don't take those corrective actions, then we continue this journey into this sort of turbulent, insolvent planet. Now, what can a risk approach add to this? Well, we know that many of the risk assessments underestimate impacts from climate change. So this was a big premise of our the Emperor's New Climate scenarios. And it's one of the reasons we're heading towards this insolvency pathway is that actually we're not recognizing the buildup of these risks. And certainly it's not getting communicated in a way that policymakers can understand and then make decisions from. And we sort of came onto, well, if these economic assessments, if current risk assessments are underestimating impacts, what would a realistic risk assessment look like for planetary solvency? How could we better this? And so we've come up with a set of principles, and these are likely to be very familiar with people that are used to doing risk assessments. They're quite qualitative. We haven't come up with any numbers on this, but it's a good approach to how you can more thoroughly assess these risks. So the first thing is we're saying, well, actually, when we're assessing climate change, when we're assessing nature and societal risks, we need a risk-led approach. Why is that? Well, it's because we're operating with high levels of uncertainty. We've got big downside risks, so plenty of things that you want to avoid. And a risk-led approach means that we're identifying and setting appropriate limits for the risks we're willing to accept. We're then monitoring against those limits. We're looking at where we're tracking, and we're being transparent on the risks we're taking on and essentially agreeing that are socially acceptable. Now, risk management encourages earlier action. So even when we've got scientific uncertainty telling us we're not quite sure this thing will happen, we're not quite sure there's a cause and effect here, risk management says, well, even if these things might occur, if the downside risk is very high, we should be very cautious and we should do things that mitigate the impacts if they emerge or to avoid them emerging altogether. And an example of this from a climate tipping element perspective, if we know scientific evidence says, well, actually, Greenland ice sheet collapses somewhere between 0.8 and 3 degrees of warming. So that's the science. It's told us that there's a range. They can't pin it down to more than that. Now, a risk management approach would say, well, let's assume prudence. Let's assume it's on the lower end, because the impact of that happening is 7 meters of sea level rise, and we don't think our societies can adapt to that. If we're looking at appropriately managing these risks, so doing that risk-led approach, we also need the right indicators. So that's where our Earth system primacy comes in. We want indicators that are leading indicators, not lag indicators. And to do that, we need to look at the Earth system. So if we're monitoring economic impacts, if we're monitoring the emergence of extreme weather events, we're monitoring the impact. We're shutting that stable door after the horse has bolted. We need to be looking at our planetary boundaries, so our soil health, our nutrient cycling, our climate levels, so levels of warming, because these are the things that tell us what is likely to come in the future. We also need to think in systems. So this is the systemic part of the risk assessment. And this is because we know that these risks and our responses to these risks have interactions. We looked at this in detail in Climate Scorpion. So I'm just going to jump onto a diagram from Scorpion. And this is what a systemic risk assessment that looked at the drivers, climate and nature as drivers of societal risks. And what we can see from this is that you've got feedbacks between multiple loops in this diagram, and there are huge interactions. And we know that these sort of climate and nature risks drive sort of societal changes, so displacement, conflict, and that derailment risk, so the risk of the transition not happening because we're tied up dealing with the impacts of climate change. And we know that these all act together. The other part of a systemic risk assessment is tipping points. So recognizing that you're going to have these discontinuities, and that you might get sudden jumps of irreversible change. Just going around again, we then need to explore the full range of outcomes. So again, this might be quite familiar for those of us that are used to doing climate scenario analysis. We need imaginative scenarios. We need to look at tail risks, and we need to include combinations and interactions. So plenty of getting together experts, exploring how risks might interact and cascades might be set off, and coming up with sort of those types of causal loop diagrams. And possibly more crucially, as a society, we have to decide which of these outcomes we find unacceptable, and therefore we position those as they are way out of our risk appetite, even if their probability is low. And then we have to be quite explicit about those value judgments, because they should be subject to public scrutiny, because of course your tolerance for these various risks is very much going to depend on who you are and where you live. And you also want to look at the full time horizon. So Yes, from a financial institution perspective, when we've looked at our climate scenarios, a lot of the regulatory exercises have been sort of 30-year scenarios. But actually, from a governance and governmental perspective, we don't really want an arbitrary cutoff. 2100 is often that cutoff, but we would like to assume that society continues beyond then. And some of these risks have really big lags. So particularly things on sea level rise, where those risks are sort of what we consider unadaptable, they have big time lags. So they would not show up in an assessment up to 2100 because the full impact emerges way beyond that. And then using sort of latest science. So just a recognition here that the IPCC and IPBES, so the sort of international communities for climate change and nature scientific assessments and then reporting, their assessment cycles are quite long. And so we need to find ways to incorporate more recent science in a timely manner into our risk assessments. And also they're sort of subject to political, not influence, but editing. So there's a whole process where all of the parties to those assessments have to agree the wording. So again, we have to think from a risk management perspective whether they should be caveated for some of those things. So for the time delays and that sort of political editing. We also need incentives to flag risks. So again, this is where actuaries and the risk profession, we are incentivized to flag risks. The scientific community is not. They are much more likely to be on the cautious side. They don't want to be identified as being too alertist or alarmist. And we need to think about how we can create incentives for people to actually act on those risk assessments and escalate them. There's an element there of education, so making sure that policymakers are educated enough in a risk assessment that they can build it into their decision making. And there's also a large part of collaborating across disciplines. So one of the things we've learned with working with climate scientists is that actually we all have very different ways of operating and we can act in our own silos. And unless we actually breach that gap and start talking to one another, we learn an awful lot about the way things happen. And we can have a much bigger impact and reach a totally different audience. And then largely the sort of last part, it really isn't the least part because it's the important bit. It's that governance and reporting, and it sounds the sort of driest part, but how do we get information to decision makers? How do we make sure there's education of decision makers so they can action it? How do we communicate areas of uncertainty? How do we communicate judgments and ultimately drive awareness of those adverse outcomes? So I said we'd dive a bit more into the risk-led methodology, and hopefully this won't scare everybody too much, but we've said that risk management requires us to think about risks that we're willing to accept and risks that we're willing not to. And this is essentially setting our risk appetite. So what we're saying here is, well, what would a risk appetite for planetary solvency look like? And then if we set that as our risk appetite, what would we look at to track, and how would we look at where we're monitoring against the risks that we're saying are in or out of appetite? So we sort of propose this. Now, if you're doing this in real life, you need a broader group of stakeholders, because when you're setting risk appetites, you have to understand at this level what types of risk is society as a whole going to accept, not just what does the group of 20 actuaries and climate scientists sat in a room on a gloomy day in November think should be a solvency risk appetite. So we've sort of proposed this, and there is a scientific basis to it, but we will all bring our own biases, etc. And so along everything from this point onwards is what we'd call in beta mode. We want input on it, and we're revising it as we go along. It's live on the Exeter website. So we've got a Planetary Solvency dashboard on the website, and I'll show you some of that later. But we are still very much in a development. How can we get out and talk to more people about this? But our version of our planetary solvency risk appetite is we seek to minimise the risk of significant societal disruption driven by climate and nature risks. And this includes avoiding crossing tipping points, avoiding habitat loss and species extinctions, avoiding climate change above 1.5 degrees. Again, debatable when you include climate justice in that, avoiding climate and nature-driven forced displacement, conflict and mass mortality, and avoiding derailment risks. So where society is too distracted by escalating climate crises that you don't address the root cause. Essentially, what this forces us to do is be explicit in our statements. This says, these are the things we are not willing to accept. And not a lot of that has actually been done in this area. We've sort of just accepted, well, okay, Paris Agreement, well below 2 degrees, without actually saying, well, what does that risk acceptance look like? We would then communicate this in a solvency risk appetite, and this is, for example, how we would report on it. Now, what this does is this says within our risk appetite, we have said these are all the risks we want to avoid, and we would want to be operating in this green or amber zone down here. And actually, if we're moving into the amber zone, we'd probably be taking some action to get us back into our green zone. However, what we're actually doing, we're behaving as if we're seeking all of these risks. And by putting it into a diagram like this, you're actually being honest with people about the levels of risk we're operating with, and hopefully making it more acute to policymakers that actually this is way out of where they've said they're going to be. And from a risk perspective, we might like to start putting some management actions, for example, into place. So sort of the second part of our planetary solvency risk assessment. So we've set our risk appetite, we've mapped this onto a diagram, but we actually need some definitions because we're going to come up with a risk matrix. And this is how we would assess our risks. And these are the categories of risks that we've come up with. Now, again, this is subject to feedback. This is subject to input from a group of scientists, of policymakers, of activists. We're presenting this at the University of Exeter Tipping Points Conference in June, where that we'll do a workshop and hopefully revise some of these definitions. But this is how we've said, okay, if we come up with a way of assessing these risks, we can then look at climate, look at nature, and we can put them into buckets and say, well, this is the level of risk we're currently operating with. So we've got a likelihood assessment down the bottom, which is fairly generic. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. But we've adapted the societal impact scale, so the rating up here, based on some categorization in the paper from Climate Endgame, so a paper that explores sort of catastrophic climate scenarios. They come up with some risk definitions around sort of what severe impacts look like, what catastrophic impacts look like, and we've adapted that across the board here. So I think their definitions include sort of human mortality and some of the climate impacts. We've expanded this to include sort of economic losses, nature, and society. So once we have those two things, we would then be mapping that onto a risk matrix, and we would have we'd have something like this. So we'd have a risk position and risk trajectory, and I'll show you an actual illustrative output in the next slide. But essentially what we've got here is anything in this top right hand corner should be flagging as take some action way out of where we want to be, and you've sort of got a overall rating and trend at the top that gives you an idea of how that assessment has happened. I'll also talk us through how we've come up with this sort of assessment currently for climate, and nature is going to come later. So this is the illustrative output, so of a high-level planetary solvency dashboard. And here we've done that risk assessment for climate, nature, society, and economy. As I say, it's in draft form, but particularly the climate one, we'll go through where we are with that. But it follows that you have your sort of current risk position. So for climate and nature, we're saying those impacts are currently severe. From an economic and societal loss perspective, we know those impacts are relatively limited, but those drivers are rising. So we know from our causal loop diagram previously, that climate and nature impacts being severe means that our economic and societal impacts will follow. And then from a trajectory perspective, all of our risks are heading sort of out of risk appetite, and we would say, well, actually, we need some urgent policy action here. From a climate change perspective, we know that risk of crossing tipping points increases rapidly beyond 1.5 degrees. So we know that's where that's sort of currently where we're heading. So I think the climate action tracker is currently saying sort of we're heading for 2.7 degrees of warming by 2100. But we also know there's a lag in terms of the impacts. So when we look at the impacts we're seeing now, these are going to get worse. So that explains the trajectory of climate from being sort of down here to being right up in the top right-hand corner. From a nature perspective, again, we're already seeing sort of stresses to food and water systems. And we know that we're breaching our planetary boundaries. So whilst our impacts are currently limited, that trajectory is expected to increase. At the same time, there are interactions with climate change. So if climate and nature would tend to move together. From a societal perspective, there's two elements to that assessment. So one is looking at the disruption to society that might occur as physical risks and resource shortages emerge. But we also look at derailment risk. So where the society response to the transition ends up derailing the transition. So that sort of current position represents a few things. So one is that we've got geopolitical tension, there's sort of ongoing active conflicts, there's also sort of fragile states that are vulnerable to climate and nature impacts, and a sort of trend towards economic protectionism. So the trajectory assumes that alongside climate and nature risks worsening those trends. And then from an economic perspective, again, we do look at the impact of this on economic performance, so GDP here. I said to Aisling before we started this, I personally don't like looking at GDP because I recognise there are all sorts of limitations to it, but it's what policymakers listen to. And so we have sort of presented this as, well, if you have against a background of worsening climate and nature impacts, we know that we depend on nature, GDP impacts would be expected to rise. So if we have a bit of a look behind the rationale behind the climate sort of assessment, we've got our emissions that are still trending upwards. We have increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And we know this is translating into higher global average temperatures. Now, particularly what we've seen here, so we've got on the right-hand side here, is the average across a 12-month period. And you can see that for 2023 and 2024, those levels have been much higher than previous years. There's been quite a big jump. Now, what is interesting is that we have 2023 was a El Nino period. So it's a period of global average temperatures being warmer than normal. So if we had that one period of 2023 where that was happening, we wouldn't necessarily be over particularly concerned. But what we have seen is a move to a La Nina period, which is a cooler than average period, and we haven't seen a reversal of that change in global average temperatures. Now, one risk that we flag here is the reduction in aerosols. So reduction in aerosols in the atmosphere is deemed positive because they create all sorts of problems like pollution, acidification, all of that sort of stuff. But the impact on warming is that aerosols have a cooling effect. And one of the big risks that we identified through sort of a number of workshops was that we could have a higher than expected climate sensitivity. And that's the amount of warming you get in response to increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's expected to be around 3 degrees if you double carbon dioxide concentrations from pre-industrial levels. But there are scientists that think it's higher. Now, if it is higher, and the cooling effect of aerosols is bigger than we expected, we have two very large offsetting numbers. And if we remove one of those numbers, so we remove the aerosols, but our climate sensitivity is still very high, we're going to end up with much higher levels of warming. And this is where sort of identifying that as a potential risk really adds value. So if we look at the Planetary Solvency Climate Risk Dashboard and bringing all of this together, this is sort of an example of the output. And this is the sort of thing that we would, alongside a risk matrix, report to policyholders. So at the top here, we've got an overall headline. And as I said, there is some debate on Paris Agreement goals. The goals themselves weren't really set with that sort of risk perspective in mind. And as we've had more science emerging since then, actually our safe limits, whilst our safe limit might be 1.5 degrees, when Johan Rockstrom and his group have looked at social justice and what might be fair to society, and how that might impact where they set their planetary boundaries, they found that the just limit tends to bite before the safe limit. So actually what we might deem as acceptable on a societal level is much lower. And actually the climate limit gets revised down to 1 degree of warming post-industrial. And I think what Paris really highlights is its limits that have been set into what is accepted by political negotiation rather than what is acceptable from a risk perspective. The other element that has sort of developed in recent years is the scientific information on climate tipping points. So understanding that those tipping points really do emerge in that 1.5 to 2 degree range, and that anything over 1.5 really accelerates the risk of crossing those tipping point thresholds. The next sort of point on the dashboard is you have in the top right-hand corner is this sort of risk position and trajectory. So again, you can have a conversation. It's easy to digest. And then we sort of have a high level explanation of our risk ratings and our trends that give us some ideas of why we're rating them in this way. And then we have a summary of our risk positions, so trajectories and areas of uncertainty. So this is really important, actually, is areas where things are uncertain and how that might be important for policymakers, for anyone using this information. And then finally, some proposed actions required to push us from that trajectory or into the red zone, back into the amber and green zone. And so this is the sort of dashboard that could be presented for sort of discussion. We also have a draft version of a nature dashboard. So again, this is very much in the early stages. There's 2 work streams that have come out of the Planetary Solvency report. One is revising this dashboard for nature risks, so doing that more thorough nature risk assessment. And the other is look at sort of an actuarial view on that climate sensitivity. So looking at the scientific evidence and applying a risk-based lens to climate sensitivity and thinking about whether that might change the way we look at things. So just as we sort of think to finish up, I'm coming on to sort of recommendations and where we might be in terms of taking things on. So I think the main thing is we would recommend doing these planetary solvency risk assessments in line with those resilient principles, and having governance set up so that there's responsibility for acting on it. As with everything, it's up for debate. There is no sort of one size fits all approach. Different people will have different views, and we can sort of incorporate that. But we then need to integrate those risk assessments into governmental frameworks. So having somebody in governments, both at a local level and a global level, to act on these, and thinking about, who owns something like this. It is really difficult. We've seen challenges to sort of global institutions more recently. It's very difficult to say, well, this sort of group of people should be responsible for this assessment, because actually gaining teeth on something and getting traction it is more difficult. But we also need sort of an ability to track the delivery of plans. So if we're saying we're going to implement management actions, we need to know what those actions are, who is responsible for delivering them, and how we're progressing against them. Have they had the desired impact, etc. We also need to look at setting those solvency limits so that respecting planetary boundaries, but incorporating sort of justice and fairness. And in order to allow people to act on these and set appropriate limits, we need to build policymaker capacity. So we need policymakers to be better at understanding these risks and acting upon them. And then finally, we need to try and mitigate some of this. So yes, decarbonisation and the right incentives by governments to facilitate that, as well as sort of restoring nature, which of course is a key part of that. But we also need to think about how we adapt. So how do we potentially remove greenhouse gas emissions? How do we repair our ecosystems? How do we build resilience where there are things that are just beyond those thresholds and beyond a way in which we can manage it? So those are sort of, hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of the report and what we're trying to do. There's quite a lot in there. As I say, there are sort of further work streams coming out of it. And if anybody is interested in sort of getting involved, even leading something. So I know, Aisling is thinking about doing something local to Ireland. If anybody is interested, then please do let us know, because we're in that phase currently of reaching out to people. We want people to be using this work. We don't want it to just sort of sit there collecting dust. So yeah, if there is anybody interested, then please do contact us. I will pause there for questions.
Thanks, Lucy. That was quite the tour de force. And yes, before we kind of go to questions, I think it probably is worth mentioning that as kind of trailed by Ros Briggs, our president, in her recent speech at the biennial dinner, that there is an intent by the Sustainability and Climate Change Committee to leverage this really fine piece of work in an Irish context. With kind of an overlay of just kind of some of the kind of Irish dimensions to it. And actually, interestingly, we were actually talking about today's planning for today's webinar last week, just as kind of an RTE news item popped up in my feed, which was based on a report compiled for the Environmental Protection Agency by some academics from Dublin City University, which has as one of its recommendations that Ireland should appoint a commissioner for long-term thinking to advise on adapting to climate change. So very congruent, Lucy, with the work. And we've also worth just mentioning that just this morning, in fact, a group of of us from the Sustainability and Climate Change Committee, led by Cialo Dooling, had a meeting with academics from Maynooth to try and explore as to whether there are opportunities to collaborate in the way that the IFoA has so very successfully done with this report and its predecessors. Because as Lucy and I were talking about earlier, and as you mentioned, Lucy, in your presentation, academics tend to be very cautious and perhaps not always connected into the mainstream and the GDP world. As you say, the downsides to thinking about GDP, but that's kind of tends to be one of the key things to get traction in the policymaking space. And Lucy was also saying to me that this report has had quite a lot of traction internationally, which is good to hear. And I know that the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios paper also had very kind of widespread impacts. So I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A. So please, if you have questions, either pop them into the Q&A now or raise your hand, and we can bring you up on screen to ask your question directly to Lucy. I have one to start us off, Lucy, if I may. So you mentioned derailment risk in the course of your paper. I mean, if you had to kind of give your own view right now on where we are on derailment risk, particularly in the light of all things happening on the other side of the Atlantic, how pessimistic or optimistic would your view be?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's difficult because I think I sort of participate in a lot of things looking at sort of derailment risk, doom loops, and things like that. So, and there is some research going on at Chatham House about how these things can potentially emerge. But yeah, exactly as you say, there is a lot of upheaval currently, and I think we are seeing some of these really real risks playing out. And then from a sort of policymaker perspective, it's trying to step back and go, well, okay, if that is happening, what are the positive feedbacks that we can accelerate? Because they're focused on the things you can control, but also making sure that you're doing everything you can to sort of avoid getting caught up in those things. But I think it's what essentially we're talking about when we're decarbonising is huge, large-scale system change, and nothing happens like that without large amounts of societal disruption. So it's difficult to say, well, are we seeing sort of something that is a normal amount, or is this way beyond, and is this sort of significant risks? And I think it probably is. You know, the changes we've seen have been fairly disappointing. And I hinted at one of the really difficult things is knowing where this lands. How do you put somebody in charge, even if you had chief risk officers in each government globally? They're all going to have different views. How do you make sure that the voices that are hugely impacted are the ones that are heard? Because I sort of alluded to, we could set levels of risk that we sat in the UK or sat somewhere else in the world are comfortable taking, that other people are just not, because it has significant impacts on their livelihoods. So that ownership piece, that global governance piece, is really hard in the current situation. And as I was thinking about what I would say on that today, that was one thing I sort of came up against and thought that's a really difficult question. Because yeah, when you sort of write down, oh well, global governance is needed, and you sort of sit back and go, well, great, but how well is the Paris Agreement really doing at the moment? So yeah, it's fairly depressing.
Well, on that note, I'll move on to some of the questions from our attendees. So there are a couple of related questions, actually. One is, what has surprised you about media coverage of the paper? And then Joe Kennedy is asking, what has worked so far in engaging with policymakers about the messages from the paper?
Yeah, so the media coverage has been really positive. I think one of the things we've learned from doing more and more reports is how to engage with the media. Now, I personally don't do it, but the IFoA are very good at it. So they have media contacts, they release sort of embargoed versions of reports so that it can get good coverage. And you can see that in the change over time between our first report and the latest one. Because people, once they've read one, they go, actually, this is quite good. This is new. This is bringing something different. And then when you bring something else out, they continue to sort of act on it. So I think that's been a sort of learning element. I think one of the things that sort of always depresses me a bit is that we're a relatively small group, but because we deal with the financial system, people sort of listen to us. The reason that depresses me is not because people listen to us, but is because the poor climate scientists have been screaming this from the rooftops for decades. And then a relatively small group of actuaries that sort of say, well, actually, the financial impacts of this could be really big, get the sort of credit for alerting. But it's a way of, well, actually, this is a totally different way of looking at things. I think from a policymaker perspective, yeah, there has been times where the difference between having a good basing in risk, and it isn't just actuaries, but anyone who manages risk knows what we're talking about. They get the concepts. Actually pulling that into the view of policymakers, it's totally new to them. So it's not unusual to talk to a group of actuaries or talk to a group of risk managers about it. And they're like, yeah, this seems obvious, like there's nothing hugely controversial here. But you'll talk to a policymaker that says, oh, wow, this is the first time I've ever heard of this. And so actually, that has been a useful learning in sort of getting the message out there and how we communicate to them better and how we engage with them. And we've chosen quite sort of strategically who we collaborate with on these papers, so that we can sort of get into places where we think we're going to have influence.
That's really interesting, Lucy. And you actually mentioned to me before the call that Tim Lenton's mother, Tim being one of the co-authors, who's kind of got a very, very prestigious academic record. His mother found that this was the first time anybody in her circle had ever mentioned something published by her son to her. So that was kind of speaks to your point. So we have a question from Roz Briggs, which is, so first of all, thank you for Lucy for your comprehensive and informative presentation. She's wondering how much support or collaboration you're receiving from international actuarial organizations.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I've actually just finished chairing the IAA's SDGs task force. And I've learned quite a lot from that because they operate in quite a different way. But one of the things I've learned is that actually working at a global level, it's probably similar in government, is that everyone has their own different areas of focus and they're at their different stage of their journey in terms of sustainability. And so getting everybody on the same page is much more difficult. So I don't think we would have got so many impactful reports out if we'd done it purely from an IAA perspective. In the early days, we did try and get sort of global associations. So we reached out internationally and said, can you, when you release this paper, when we release it, would you put a statement of support? Even something like that was really hard because getting a consensus of, well, this professional body has done this piece of work, do we agree with it? Well, we might at a high level, but there's certain things in there that we don't quite agree with, therefore we're not comfortable putting a statement out. So it's interesting. But I think it sort of amazed me really that actually the IFoA has been pretty agile at getting these things out and getting that sort of just support behind it, really. So I would say, yes, there's definitely more work to do internationally. Having said that, Sandy, who is one of the co-authors on this report, and I'm sure people will know him anyway, he is about to take up a role at the IAA on their Sustainability and Climate Change Committee. So again, we'll hopefully bring some of those views more globally.
I've found the same myself in working with the IAA. I think there's a level of caution there about, trying to be representative of the views of all dimensions of the actuarial profession, which perhaps and a lot of, I suppose, just sensitivity to political considerations as well. So that's kind of definitely a challenge. So a question from Seamus O'Shea. The 3-degree scenario and 4 billion deaths by 2050 is a very impactful statement. What degree of confidence is there around this happening? I have to say, actually, what I found more shocking, Lucy, about the parameterization, and you mentioned it's going to be discussed in Exeter in June, is the low impact being more than 80 million deaths, because if we sort of do a comparison with COVID, and I don't know what the the final estimates are, but it was a lot less than that, and yet you're characterizing that as a low outcome from climate change. But anyway, Seamus's question is, what is the likelihood of the 3-degree and the 4 billion deaths?
Yeah, so I think it's less of a sort of confidence around likelihood. It's more about that categorization of this is where we place those risks. On the mortality impacts, it's difficult because you're not just talking about like primary sort of impacts on heat waves, natural disasters. You're also talking about trying to get those secondary impacts through from things like migration, conflict, even stuff like stresses on health systems. So in a heat wave, people that ordinarily wouldn't die may die because your health systems are overloaded. Similarly, stuff like loss of economic activity. So again, if you're losing your job and your economic prosperity is linked to sort of longevity, it's trying to come up with all of those things. So I think the degree of confidence is probably not very, and it's an area where actuaries could have a huge impact, and we'd like to sort of do more in that area. So again, it's probably one of the areas that we need to look at in a bit more detail. But I hope that gives a bit of a flavour of all the sort of different combinations that we're trying to bring into sort of an assessment like that.
And for those interested in reading more, there's a recent paper by a US actuary called Sam Gutterman, which looks at the potential climate impacts on mortality, which I would recommend. I would also recommend, to be honest, a piece of fiction, if you're kind of interested in thinking through what some of these scenarios might look like in a kind of a more, I suppose, narrative way. The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson gives kind of a real flavour of what might in adverse scenarios lie ahead of us. There's 2 more questions in the chat. I'm going to ask them, and then I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time and draw us to a conclusion. So one is around risk reporting. So it says, risk reporting is something of an acquired taste, even for actuaries. What have you found yourself doing differently from what actuaries might think is normal?
Yeah, so I think that one is the systemic part. And this is where actually this report gets a little bit of criticism of, well, what can I take out of this to do to my day job? How does this translate into something that I can manage risk in my organization? And ultimately, our target audience is beyond that. Our target audience really for this report is sort of policymakers, because we're talking systemic impacts. We're talking risks that cannot be managed at an individual level, risks that require collective action. So that's been the sort of biggest difference, I think, on those. And I think I was just picking up James' question as well, because I know we're sort of short on time. But I think in terms of additional actions, and again, I think we were talking about this earlier, Aisling, is actually thinking about some of the positive feedback loops. So again, Exeter have been really good at this on looking at positive tipping points, positive social tipping points. We need to accelerate towards those. We need to sell that to people. Whilst also bringing concepts like this. So how do we stress and highlight our planetary insolvency? I think that's the communication piece, right? This is saying, look, these are the risks we're accepting. This is what it means for people. Is this really acceptable? And getting that into the discussion. Unfortunately, it sort of goes by the wayside when you're, and again, example of a derailment risk, when you're dealing with things like a cost of living crisis, right? You know, we've seen food price spikes because of some of the damages to crops that we're already seeing from climate change, yet we have, and at the same time, we've simultaneously seen a global movement away from that, from dealing with climate impacts. So it's an example of where that is sort of really running true to life, but it's that organized approach, I think, that we need to be taking.
And I think that's where I think the profession, the actuarial profession, as you say, we are listened to, and I think that's communication piece is something that the Society of Actuaries will be really focusing on in the coming months. Lucy, thanks a million, as always. Absolutely fascinating. I don't know how you managed to do all that you do as a volunteer. We really appreciate your taking the time to come and present to us. And thank you to everybody for attending. Bye for now.